The letter fell from the Bible like a confession no one had meant to make. Eliza Dawson was 12 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she had been hunting for a pressed flower her Sunday school teacher said she could borrow for a nature display. She had not expected to find a sealed envelope, cream-colored and stiff with age, tucked so deliberately between the pages of Psalms that it felt less like forgetfulness and more like burial. She had not expected to see handwriting on the front that she did not recognize looping, elegant letters that spelled out a name in faded ink. David Dawson, Clearwater Ranch, Broken Creek, Texas. She had not expected, when she carefully pulled the letter free, to notice that the wax seal on the back was still perfectly intact, unbroken, as though whoever had sent it back had never wanted it opened in the first place, or whoever had received it back had never been able to bear the looking. The return address read, Lavinia Carter, Fort Griffin, Texas, 1882. Eliza turned the envelope over twice, studying the handwriting, feeling the weight of it the way you feel the weight of something that has been waiting. She walked to the kitchen where her father sat at the table with his coffee, a man who had aged quietly and without complaint, a man who had shut some part of himself away so long ago that his daughter had simply grown accustomed to the locked door. She set the letter on the table in front of him. David Dawson's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The color left his face like water leaving a basin. "Where did you find that?" he said. It was not a question. It came out flat and low, the voice of a man seeing a ghost he thought he had buried thoroughly enough. "It was in the Bible," Eliza said. "In Psalms, Papa, the seal is still on it. You never opened it. Give it to me." He reached for it and his hand was not entirely steady. Eliza pulled it back, not defiantly but with the careful deliberation of a child who senses she has stumbled onto something important, something true, something that the adults in her world have conspired not with malice perhaps, but with a kind of exhausted cowardice to keep hidden. "Who is Lavinia Carter?" David Dawson set his coffee cup down. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He stared at the envelope the way a man stares at a wound he has learned to ignore until someone else points at it. "Give it here, Eliza. I want to know who she is. She is no one who concerns you." That was the wrong thing to say to a girl built from her father's stubbornness and her mother's fire, and somewhere in the closed and private chambers of David Dawson's chest, he knew at the moment the words left his mouth. Eliza broke the seal. "Eliza." She unfolded the single page, and she began to read aloud, her young voice carrying the words of a woman who had written them 4 years ago in desperate, absolute sincerity, each sentence landing in the quiet kitchen like stones dropped into still water. "David, I have been sitting with this silence for 6 months now, and I cannot carry it anymore. I know what you believe happened. I know what Harlan Briggs told you, and I know that you believed him because believing him was easier than coming to find out the truth from me. But I am asking you, I am begging you, if that word does not offend your pride, to consider that the man who drove between us had reasons to lie, reasons rooted in money and land, and a dark past you only partly know. I sent the ring back because you told me to. I obeyed because I thought it would show you that I respected your decision. But I want you to know what is true before this silence becomes permanent. I loved you, David Dawson. I love you still. I am not asking you to come back to me. I am only asking you to know the truth. You're Lavinia." The kitchen was absolutely silent. David Dawson had one hand pressed over his eyes. Eliza lowered the letter. She stared at her father, this man she had grown up beside, this man she had watched move through the world like something vital had been removed from him, and she understood with the raw intuitive clarity that children sometimes possess before the world teaches them to doubt it, that this was the wound. This was the locked door. This was what the silence had been about. "Papa," she said softly. He did not look up. "Papa," she said, "she loved you." And the story of how David Dawson and Lavinia Carter had arrived at this moment, a sealed letter in a Bible, a daughter's voice carrying the words across 4 years of wasted silence. That story began long before either of them had understood what they were building or what they stood to lose. It began in the autumn of 1880, in the Texas Panhandle, when the grasslands were the color of old gold, and the sky ran from horizon to horizon without apology. Broken Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by a man named Otis Fenn, a saloon called the Rattler that served decent whiskey if you did not ask too many questions about where it came from, a post office that doubled as a barber shop, a one-room schoolhouse, and a church that the circuit preacher visited 4 times a year and the rest of the congregation treated as a social hall in the intervening months. It had a livery, a blacksmith, 3 homesteads within riding distance, and Clearwater Ranch, which sat at the edge of town and belonged, as it had for 11 years, to David Dawson. David had come to Clearwater at 19, raw and determined, with the deed his father had left him, and the absolute conviction that he could build something out of the land if he worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough. By 30 he had proven himself right. The ranch ran 400 head of cattle, employed 6 hands through the summer and 3 through the winter, and had a reputation for honest dealing that was, in the Texas cattle country of 1880, worth nearly as much as the land itself. He was not a man given to easy expression. He was built lean and careful, with the kind of quiet that comes from years of measuring words against consequence. He had dark hair and darker eyes, and the particular brand of handsomeness that requires no acknowledgement because it does not seek any. The women of Broken Creek had noticed him for years. He had, with polite and consistent deflection, declined to notice back. He had a daughter. Her mother, a woman named Clara who had come west from St. Louis with more optimism than preparation, had died of a fever when Eliza was 3. David had raised the girl himself with the help of a housekeeper named Mrs. Aldrich, who came 3 days a week, and who had strong opinions about everything from the proper temperature for pie crust to the proper age at which a girl should be allowed to ride alone. David had loved Clara in the steady, practical way of a young man who had chosen well and known it. When she died, he had grieved privately, efficiently, and then he had placed his grief somewhere interior and returned to the work of the ranch and the raising of his daughter, because there was no other viable option, and David Dawson was not a man who sat down in the middle of things. Lavinia Carter arrived in Broken Creek on a Tuesday in October of 1880, aboard the westbound stage, with a carpet bag, a second trunk that was shipped separately, and the air of a woman who had made a deliberate decision and was committed to seeing it through. She was 24 years old. She had grown up in Fort Griffin, the daughter of a doctor, well-educated by frontier standards, with brown hair that she kept pinned but which had a tendency to come loose in the wind, and green eyes that people remembered long after they had forgotten everything else about meeting her. She was not fragile and she was not reckless. She was precise and warm, with a gift for honesty that some people found refreshing and others found unsettling, depending on what they had to hide. She had come to Broken Creek to take the position of schoolteacher. The previous teacher, a young man named Albrecht from Ohio, had lasted 8 months before the isolation and the dust and the particular loneliness of a frontier town made him pack his bags and head back east. The school board, consisting of Otis Fenn, the preacher on one of his quarterly visits, and a rancher named Harlan Briggs who had more money than anyone else in the county and a corresponding belief in his own authority, had placed an advertisement in 3 Texas newspapers and received 5 responses. They had chosen Lavinia because her references were excellent, her penmanship was impeccable in her correspondence, and her letter of application had contained a line that old Otis Fenn had read aloud at the selection meeting, and that had settled the matter. I do not come to the frontier as a temporary measure or a curiosity. I come because I believe that education given to a child at the edge of the world matters exactly as much as education given at the center of it. The school board had voted unanimously. Lavinia had arrived with no knowledge of what or who waited for her in Broken Creek beyond the terms of her employment, a monthly salary of $22, use of the small house beside the schoolhouse, and the expectation that she would serve the full 2-year contract she had signed. She had not arrived looking for love. That was important. She had arrived looking for purpose, and purpose was what she found in the 31 children between the ages of 6 and 14 who filled the schoolhouse benches on her first morning and regarded her with the wary assessment of young people who have learned that adults come and go, and the only constant is the land outside the window. She won them over in the first week, not by being soft, she was not soft, but by being fair, and by demonstrating in small, consistent ways that she intended to remain. She hammered the loose board in the doorframe herself rather than waiting for someone to do it. She brought books from her trunk, novels and histories, and read to the class in the last 20 minutes of each day. She learned every child's name by the third day and used each one with a specificity that told the child they had been seen. She met David Dawson in her third week. At the autumn social the town held every October in the churchyard, a gathering fueled by donated food and the communal need to celebrate something before the winter set in. He came alone, as was his custom. He stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider and spoke when spoken to, and when people moved away, he did not move after them. Eliza, who was 8 at the time, had abandoned him within minutes to chase the other children around the churchyard in some game involving a captured grasshopper. Lavinia had been introduced to half the town already and was working her way through the other half when she turned from a conversation with Mrs. Aldrich and found herself facing him. Mrs. Aldrich made the introduction with the particular efficiency of a woman who has been orchestrating such moments for years and wishes it acknowledged. "Miss Carter, this is David Dawson of Clearwater Ranch. His daughter Eliza is in your class." "Eliza Dawson," Lavinia said, and something opened in her face, genuine and unrehearsed. She wrote the most remarkable composition last week about the life cycle of a river. "I would like to encourage her in that direction." David looked at her. Not the polite surface-looking that was his usual interaction with people he had just met, but the real kind, the kind where something in you actually recognizes something in them before your mind has caught up with what's happening. "She mentions you," he said, "more than she's mentioned a teacher before. I hope favorably. She said you read to them at the end of the day." "I do." "What do you read?" "Right now, Treasure Island. Though I have received 3 letters from parents concerned that it is too adventurous for a school curriculum." "What did you say to them?" "I said that adventure is precisely what a curriculum needs and that I intended to continue." A silence settled between them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that forms when two people are still processing the encounter. David looked at her again briefly and then looked away. "I'm not one of the 3 who wrote," he said. "I know," said Lavinia. "I would have recognized the handwriting." He was almost startled into a smile. She watched it happen and then watched him redirect it, and that was when she understood that this man was in the habit of pulling back from his own warmth, had been doing it long enough that it had become reflex, and that this was probably important information. She did not pursue him. She was not the pursuing kind, and beyond that she was new here, and she had a contract to honor and a professional reputation to build. But she thought about that almost smile on the walk home, and she thought about it again the next morning when Eliza came in early to help arrange the books on the shelf, and she understood that whatever Eliza Dawson was curious and bright and hungry for a world larger than the one she had been born into. She had not come from nowhere. The courtship, such as it was, happened the way most significant things happen, gradually, then suddenly, and then all at once. It happened in the meetings that could not entirely be avoided in a town the size of Broken Creek. At the store, at church when the preacher came through, at the small informal suppers that the school board members hosted throughout the winter to discuss curriculum and the general state of education in the county. David attended these because he was on the board, a position he had accepted 2 years earlier with the same quiet sense of civic duty that led him to donate labor when a neighbor's barn burned, and to sit on the county committee that managed the water rights disputes that were, by 1880, becoming something like a permanent feature of Texas life. It happened in the conversations about Eliza, which began as purely professional and became something else so gradually that neither of them could have identified the exact moment. Lavinia stayed after the board meetings to talk with David about his daughter's progress. The girl was exceptional, genuinely exceptional, and Lavinia wanted to talk about what might be possible for her. And these conversations extended, incrementally, beyond Eliza and into other territory. They talked about books. David had read more than she expected. He had grown up poor and had educated himself largely through whatever he could find, and he had opinions about what he had read that were unpolished but original. Lavinia found this more interesting than the opinions of men who had been educated into their views. They talked about the land. He knew it the way you know something you have worked with your hands for 11 years, not romantically but specifically. He talked about water tables and grass varieties, and the behavior of cattle in drought conditions, with the fluency of a man for whom these things were not abstract concerns, but daily reality. She asked questions because she was genuinely curious, and because the precision of his knowledge moved something in her that she could not quite name. They talked, one evening in February when the board meeting had ended and the other members had gone and they had somehow both remained, standing in the churchyard under a sky crowded with stars, about loneliness. Not directly, not naming it, but the conversation moved toward it and around it, and they both understood what they were circling. Eliza told me, Lavinia said, that her mother liked to watch the stars. Clara did, David said. She had names for them, not the actual names, her own names for the patterns she saw. What did she call them? He was quiet for a moment, and she understood she had asked something tender, but he answered. She called that one the shepherd, he pointed at a cluster, and that one over there she called the crossing because she said it looked like two roads meeting. Lavinia looked at the constellation he had indicated. I can see why she'd say that. You would have liked her, David said. She was straight with people, didn't say things sideways. I try not to. I know, he said. I've noticed. He walked her home that night. He had started doing this after the October social, not every night, but after the evening meetings, after the board gatherings, and she had accepted without making anything of it, because making something of it felt like it would require them to name what was happening before either of them was ready for the naming. At her door he said good night, and she said good night, and then he turned back once, briefly, the way a person turns back when they've thought of something they almost didn't say. Miss Carter. Lavinia, she said. She had told him twice before, but he kept reverting. Please. Lavinia. He said her name like it was something he was trying for size. I wondered if you might want to come out to the ranch sometime. Eliza has been asking. She wants to show you the foal that was born last month. I would like that very much, she said. She went to the ranch the following Saturday, and the visit lasted from morning until dinner, and over the course of it something shifted decisively between them. She helped Eliza name the foal. They settled, after extensive deliberation, on Compass. And she watched David Dawson with his daughter and understood something about him that she had only suspected before. That he was a man capable of enormous tenderness, that he had simply chosen, after loss, to keep it very close to the center, to protect it from unnecessary exposure, and that this was not coldness but caution, which is an entirely different thing and far more workable. He showed her the ranch. He showed her the pastures where the cattle grazed in the winter light, and the creek that gave the ranch its name, and the small orchard he had planted 8 years ago that was only now beginning to produce fruit consistently. He pointed out the line of cottonwoods along the water and explained what he was planning to do with the east section in the spring. She listened, not politely. Actually listened, with the full attention that was one of the things about her that would later drive him to complete distraction. The way she gave her whole presence to whatever was in front of her, as though she had decided in advance that this moment was worth it. At dinner, which Mrs. Aldrich had left prepared in the kitchen, Eliza talked about school with her usual enthusiastic candor, reporting to her father everything Lavinia had been teaching them, and asking Lavinia to confirm or expand on various details with the air of a child who is testing the consistency of her sources. David Dawson watched the two of them across the table. He watched Lavinia laugh at something Eliza said, and the way the laugh was genuine rather than performed, and the way his daughter looked at this woman, not with the desperate hunger of a motherless child seeking a replacement, but with the specific admiration of a person who has found someone they want to learn from. After dinner, after Eliza had been sent to bed, they sat on the porch and he said, "I'd like you to come back. To see Compass. Among other reasons," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the cool evening air, with the stars overhead and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, and she said, "I'd like that." He kissed her for the first time in April, on a Saturday when she had come to the ranch to help Eliza with a school project involving pressed wildflowers and the identification of native plants. The kiss happened in the kitchen doorway, quiet and careful and utterly intentional, and afterward he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, uncertain in a way that was entirely endearing in a man who was otherwise so composed, and she smiled and said, "David, I am not going to break." By May they were riding out together in the early morning, before the day got too warm. By June the town had noticed and formed its opinions accordingly, which in a small town means that everyone knew and no one said anything directly, but the invisible social adjustments had been made. By July they had said the words that needed saying privately on the porch of the ranch in the deep quiet of a summer night, and what was between them had a name. He did not ask her to marry him immediately. He thought about it. She knew he was thinking about it, and she gave him room to think because she understood that a man who had lost someone did not take such questions lightly, and that was not something she wanted to rush. But she also knew, had known since February, if she was honest, had known since the night he told her the names Clara had given the stars, that her answer would be yes. She had not accounted for Harlan Briggs. Harlan Briggs was the largest landowner in the county, a man in his mid-40s who had built his fortune through a combination of genuine hard work and the particular ruthlessness that passes for good business sense when it belongs to the right people. He was not crude. He was polished, in fact, with the kind of carefully maintained surface that in the absence of scrutiny could pass for respectability. He wore good clothes and had a loud laugh and donated generously to the church, and the people of Broken Creek liked him in the unexamined way that people like those with money and certainty. He also wanted Clearwater Ranch. He had wanted it for 3 years, since a survey had identified that the creek running through David's land connected to an aquifer that, if properly managed, could water twice the acreage Briggs currently ran his cattle on. In a land increasingly defined by water rights, this made David Dawson's property not merely valuable but strategically critical. He had approached David twice about buying it. David had declined twice, without discourtesy but without ambiguity. Briggs understood that David did not want to sell. He also understood that circumstances could be made to change. He had watched the development between David and Lavinia with the calculating eye of a man who is always looking for leverage. He had seen what it meant to David, the riding, the ranch visits, the change that had come into a man who had been closed for years, and he had understood, with the cold clarity of a person untroubled by the rights of others to their own happiness, that what a man most cherishes is also what can most effectively be used against him. In late August, Briggs rode into Broken Creek on a weekday afternoon and visited Lavinia at the schoolhouse after the children had gone home. She did not know what he wanted. She had had only a few superficial interactions with him at social gatherings, and she found him pleasant enough on the surface, if somewhat too conscious of his own authority. He told her a story. He told it well. He had prepared it carefully, and he delivered it with the convincing performance of a man who has practiced the expression of regret. He told her that he was coming to her as a friend, though he recognized she might not see it that way. He told her that he had information about David Dawson, dark past information. He called it secrets that David had kept from everyone in Broken Creek, and that Lavinia, as someone who had invested her heart in this man, deserved to know. He said that David had been accused 10 years ago of claim jumping a smaller ranch belonging to a man named Colton Pierce, effectively driving Pierce off his land through a combination of water diversion and legal manipulation that had been dressed up as legitimate dispute resolution, but had been, in Briggs's presentation, an early instance of the same ruthlessness that David had apparently continued to practice quietly ever since. He produced papers. There was a letter, official-looking, and a document that appeared to be a legal complaint. Lavinia examined them with the careful attention of a woman who had grown up watching her father assess evidence before forming conclusions. She asked questions. Briggs answered them smoothly, with the prepared fluency of a man who has thought through every angle. He expressed sorrow. He said he hoped she would think carefully before binding herself to someone who had built what he had on someone else's ruined life. She thanked him with a politeness that gave nothing away and walked him to the door and watched him ride off, and then sat down at her desk and thought for a long time. She did not go to David with accusations. She was not that kind of woman, but she went with questions 2 days later, and she asked them directly, as was her nature. The conversation went wrong from the beginning, not because Lavinia was unfair. She asked clearly, and she explained where the questions came from, and she showed him the papers Briggs had given her. But David's reaction to seeing those papers, to understanding that Briggs had gone to Lavinia with his calculated version of events, was not measured response. It was the reaction of a man who has worked for 11 years to build something honest and clean in the face of the knowledge that it was possible to build something crooked, and who is now confronted with the suggestion that someone who matters to him has been listening to the crooked version. He reacted with a cold and immediate withdrawal that was entirely out of proportion to what Lavinia had done, which was simply ask. He became a wall. He said that Colton Pierce had sold his land willingly, and that the dispute had been adjudicated fairly, and that he owed no one an accounting of his legal history. He said it with a tone that closed doors. Lavinia, who was direct and not accustomed to being treated as though honesty were an accusation, reacted to this by closing her own doors. They parted badly that evening. Neither of them said the terrible things that fear and pride had assembled. They were not people who reach for cruelty, but neither of them reached for each other either, and the distance that settled between them that night was of the particular dangerous kind that, if left unaddressed, has a tendency to solidify. The days that followed were an exercise in the kind of painful, careful, quiet suffering that two proud people inflict on each other when neither is willing to be the first to yield. They were civil when they met. They were distant. The riding had stopped. The porch evenings had stopped. Eliza, who was perceptive enough to notice the change, asked her father what had happened and was told, with a gentleness that did not disguise its finality, that sometimes things changed. What David did not know, what Lavinia did not know he did not know, was that Briggs had also visited David. He had gone to the ranch 2 days after his visit to the schoolhouse, and he had told David a different story, that Lavinia Carter had come to him, Briggs, with questions about the land dispute, questions that suggested she had been doing the kind of investigative inquiry into David's background that, in Briggs's presentation, implied she was not fully committed to the future she claimed to want with him, that she had been asking around, that she seemed to be doing what Briggs characterized, with a regretful shake of his head, as a kind of due diligence that did not reflect the trust a woman ought to have in the man she professed to love. David had stood very still while Briggs talked. He was not a fool. He knew Harlan Briggs was not a man motivated by generosity. But the particular cruelty of Briggs's information was that it operated on the thing David was already most afraid of, which was this. That what he had built with Lavinia was too good for the life he actually had, too complete and too bright for a man who had started with almost nothing and had managed to build something honest, but had not always been in a position to be certain of his own cleanness in every transaction, and that eventually she would find the cracks and step back through the door she'd come in. Briggs left him with just enough doubt to be dangerous. Neither David nor Lavinia understood, in those terrible quiet weeks, that they had both been manipulated by the same man in service of the same goal. Each of them was responding to a version of events that had been carefully constructed to produce exactly this result. In October, almost exactly 1 year after Lavinia had arrived in Broken Creek, David sent her a letter. He wrote it and rewrote it 3 times. He wrote it as honestly as he could, which was the only way he knew how to do anything, and he said that he understood if the questions she had taken to Briggs represented a genuine reconsideration of what she wanted, and that he would not hold her to anything she had not formally committed to, and that whatever she decided, he wished her well. He also said, and this was the line that cost him the most, that he had let his own pride speak in that conversation in a way that had not been fair to her, and that he was sorry for it. He sent the letter. He waited. The letter Lavinia sent back to David Dawson, the letter that would eventually end up sealed and hidden in a Bible in Psalms, was not what he had expected. She sent the ring back with it. There was no ring between them formally. They had not been officially engaged, but there was a small turquoise ring that he had given her in July, not as a proposal but as a gesture of intention, and she had worn it, and now she returned it in the envelope with a single line. "I respect your decision." David Dawson read that single line and understood it as confirmation. He was wrong. This was not confirmation but capitulation. Lavinia, who had been raised by a father who believed in dignity and self-containment, was responding to what she had read in his letter as a withdrawal, as a man offering her an exit, and she was doing what her upbringing had trained her to do when offered an exit: take it with her head up rather than beg for a door to stay open. Neither of them had said what they actually felt. Both of them were drowning in their own proud, private, utterly preventable silence. David put the ring in his coat pocket, and he put it there for 6 years before he finally moved it to the small cedar box on his dresser, and some part of him understood even then that putting it away was not the same as being finished with it. And the letter, the one she sent back with just that line, the envelope unopened because he could not bring himself to open it and read a full rejection when a half rejection was already killing him, he put it in the Bible, in Psalms, where the other hidden things were, where the prayers were, where the things you desperately wanted and could not say went. He told himself he would open it eventually. He told himself this for 4 years. In September of 1882, 2 months before Eliza found the letter, Lavinia Carter had written to him again. She had spent 4 years in Fort Griffin, where she had gone after her contract in Broken Creek ended, where she had continued teaching and tried to build the life she had planned before a man with dark eyes and a ranch full of cottonwoods had rearranged her understanding of what she wanted. She was good at her work. She found meaning in it. But the particular quality of what she had felt in Broken Creek, the sense of a life that had additional dimensions, that had warmth and weight in someone in it who saw her, that had not returned, and she was honest enough with herself to stop pretending it had been ordinary. She had learned in the spring of 1882 about Harlan Briggs. She had learned it from a man named Colton Pierce himself, who had come through Fort Griffin on his way north and had stopped in the town for 3 days. A mutual acquaintance had introduced them at a church social, and in conversation the name of Broken Creek had come up, and then the name of David Dawson, and Pierce had looked at her with surprise and said something that stopped her cold. He said that David Dawson was the man who had helped him, that the water diversion dispute had been a scheme mounted by Briggs who had wanted Pierce's land, and that David had testified on Pierce's behalf at the adjudication and had, at some personal cost in terms of his own relationship with Briggs, ensured that Pierce received fair compensation. Pierce had sold eventually, but on his own terms, with enough money to start over in Oklahoma. He had no grievance against David Dawson. He spoke of him with something close to gratitude. Lavinia had gone back to her room that night and sat with the full weight of what she had just understood. Briggs had lied to her. Briggs had used the story of Pierce's dispute to manufacture exactly the doubt he needed, and then had gone to David and manufactured the corresponding doubt about her. They had been separated by a lie, and they had helped the lie along with their own pride and silence. 4 years. 4 years of a life that had been smaller than it might have been, quieter than it might have been, and she had spent it being careful and professional and holding herself together, and all of it had been built on a foundation of deliberate betrayal by a man whose only motivation was land and water. She wrote the letter. She wrote it with all of the precision and honesty she had always brought to the things that mattered most to her. She did not beg because it was not in her to beg, but she came as close to it as her dignity would allow. She told him the truth. She told him about Pierce. She told him what she had come to understand about Briggs's hidden motives and the trap they had both been walked into. She told him that she had loved him and that she loved him still, and that she was not asking him to come back to her, only asking him to know. She sent the letter to Clearwater Ranch, Broken Creek, Texas. David received it on a Tuesday in October 1882. He sat with it in his hand for a long time. He had not heard from Lavinia Carter in 4 years. The address was her Fort Griffin address. He could not open it. This was the thing he could not explain to anyone and could barely explain to himself. That the sealed envelope in his hand represented the last remaining version of a future that he had spent 4 years trying to stop wanting, and that opening it might close that future permanently in a way that leaving it sealed somehow did not. As long as it was sealed, there was a possibility. As long as he had not read it, the worst was not confirmed. He knew this was not rational. He was a rational man mostly, but he had been carrying a turquoise ring in a cedar box for 4 years, and rationality had its limits. He put the letter in the Bible, in Psalms. He told himself he would open it when he was ready. He was not ready in October. He was not ready in November. December came and he was not ready. January brought the new year and he was not ready. Spring turned to summer to fall and he was not ready, and the next year arrived and he was not ready, and Eliza turned 12 and came home from Sunday school with a nature assignment and went looking for a pressed flower in the pages of Psalms. The morning after Eliza read the letter aloud in the kitchen, David Dawson saddled his best horse and rode to Broken Creek. He went to the telegraph office. Broken Creek had gotten a telegraph wire in 1881, one of the genuine advances of those years, and he sent a wire to Fort Griffin, to the school where Lavinia Carter had been teaching since 1882. The wire said, "I have read the letter. I know the truth. I have known my own feelings for considerably longer. If you are willing to hear from me, I will come. David Dawson." He then rode to Harlan Briggs's property. He did not go there to commit violence. He went there because he was a man who believed in looking at things directly, and there was something that needed to be looked at. He found Briggs at his stable and he dismounted, and he stood in front of him in the cool November morning, and he said, in a voice that was entirely level, "I know what you did in 1880. I know about Pierce. I know what you told Lavinia, and I know what you told me, and I know that both of them were lies built out of the same dark purpose." Briggs, to his credit or perhaps simply to his pragmatism, did not attempt to deny it with any conviction. He looked at David Dawson's expression, that stillness, that absolute controlled clarity, and he understood that the era of leverage was over. "I want you off my property," David said. "And I want you to understand that every water rights dispute you open with me from this point forward will be contested on every available front. You have made a powerful enemy over a failed gambit, Harlan. That was a poor calculation." He remounted and rode away and did not look back, and behind him, Harlan Briggs stood in the dusty yard of his expensive ranch and understood that he had, in the end, moved against a better man and lost. The telegraph reply from Fort Griffin came 2 days later, at noon. while David was working the east section with two of his ranch hands. The boy from the telegraph office rode out to find him because the message had been marked urgent, and David unfolded it with hands that were not entirely steady. It read, "I will hear from you. I have been hoping you would come for 4 years. Lavinia Carter." He read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, near where the turquoise ring had rested for a long time. He looked out at the cottonwoods along the creek, golden in the November light, and he stood very still for a moment in the way of a man who is quietly, privately, allowing something enormous to arrive. Then he went back to work, because the cattle needed moving, and he was not the kind of man who left work half done. But he was smiling, and his ranch hands noticed, and they exchanged a glance of pleased and uncomplicated satisfaction, because even people who do not know the full story can tell when something long overdue has finally been set right. He wrote a letter that evening. He took 3 hours writing it, sitting at the kitchen table with Eliza asleep in her room and the ranch quiet around him, and it was the longest thing he had written since his school days. He told her about reading her letter about Eliza finding it and reading it aloud in the kitchen, which he described with a mixture of horror and gratitude that he thought she would understand. He told her what he had done about Briggs. He told her how the ranch looked in November, because somehow it seemed important for her to picture it. He told her that the foal, Compass, was now a 4-year-old mare that Eliza rode out on every Saturday morning. He told her that he had been wrong to close himself off so quickly and so completely after their last conversation, and that whatever pride had cost him, he considered it a poor bargain. He told her about the ring, that he had kept it, that he could not bring himself to put it fully away. He told her he wanted to see her. He said it directly as he was able, which was considerable. He asked if she would come back to Broken Creek, or if she preferred that he come to Fort Griffin, and he said he would do whatever made more sense to her because the geography of the meeting mattered far less than the meeting itself. He sent the letter the next morning and counted the days until a reply could reasonably be expected. The reply came in 12 days, which, given the distance between Broken Creek and Fort Griffin via the mail routes available in 1882, was approximately as fast as could be hoped for. She wrote that she would come to Broken Creek. She wrote that she had 1 more month on her current school term, and then she was free, and that she would come in early December if that was agreeable. She wrote 3 pages, which for Lavinia Carter was a great deal. She was a woman who chose words carefully, and in those 3 pages she was more fully present than either of them had managed to be in the entire season of 1880 when they had been circling each other and not quite saying the true things. She wrote near the end, "I have been thinking about what I want to say to you when I see you, and I have realized that most of it cannot be written, and I am not going to attempt it. But I want you to know that I have thought about Compass often, and I am glad she has been well cared for." He laughed when he read that line, alone in the kitchen, a genuine laugh that surprised him. He folded the letter and put it with the first one, the one from Eliza's Bible, and they sat together in the cedar box on his dresser, where the turquoise ring also resided, a small gathering of things that had waited and were now being asked to wait only a little longer. Eliza, when told that Miss Carter was coming back to Broken Creek for a visit, responded with a controlled excitement that did her credit. She was 12 and she was her father's daughter in many ways, but she was also 12, and the excitement broke through the control fairly regularly in the following weeks in the form of inquiries about where Miss Carter would stay, and whether Miss Carter would come to the ranch, and whether Compass would remember her. "I don't know if horses remember people," David said one evening. "Compass will remember her," Eliza said with certainty. "Compass is very intelligent." "That may be," said David. "Please do not reorganize the front room on the assumption that Miss Carter will be spending time here. Let things develop as they develop." "Papa," said Eliza, with the serene patience of someone who already knows they are going to win, "I'm just going to dust the front room. It needed dusting anyway. He let her dust the front room. Lavinia Carter arrived in Broken Creek on the 3rd of December, 1882, on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week she had arrived 2 years before. She came by stage again, with her carpet bag and no second trunk this time, which David noticed and did not remark upon. He met her at the stage stop, standing there when the coach came in, hat in hand, which was not something he did as a rule but which felt appropriate. She stepped down from the coach and they looked at each other across 4 years of silence and letters and a sealed envelope hidden in the pages of Psalms, and it was not awkward. It was not complicated. It was what it actually was, which was two people who had known each other and lost each other and now had the chance to do it right, and both of them understood this with a clarity that made the social niceties almost unnecessary. "Lavinia," he said. "David," she said. He took her bag, they walked. "How was the journey?" he asked. "Long," she said. "I spent most of it rehearsing things I want to say to you. Did any of them survive the rehearsal?" "Some of them. I want to say first that I am sorry for the way I handled that conversation in 1880. I asked you a direct question, and I should have given you time to answer it before deciding I understood what the answer meant. I am sorry for how I reacted," he said. "You asked fairly and I closed like a trap. It was my worst quality brought out by fear." "What were you afraid of?" He considered this for a moment, the honest answer rather than the comfortable one. "That you had found out I wasn't what I seemed and were looking for confirmation." "You were exactly what you seemed," she said. "That was precisely the problem. I was afraid that something so apparently right could not actually be right." "We were both afraid of the same thing," he said, "and Briggs knew that." "Yes," she said. "He was very precise about where to place the doubt." "He's been warned off," David said. "He won't interfere again." She looked at him. "What did you say to him?" "I told him the truth about his chances in any future dispute with me, and I left him to think about it." "Effectively, then." "Effectively." They had reached the front of the small hotel. Broken Creek had gotten a hotel in 1881, another sign of progress, and he stopped and turned to her and said, "I have the ring. If you want it back, or something better if you'd rather. I kept it because I couldn't put it entirely away." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment in the cool December afternoon, with the bare cottonwoods visible down the road, and the familiar shapes of a town she had thought about far more often than was probably sensible. She reached out and touched his hand, very briefly, the specific gesture of a woman who is not being tentative, but is being deliberate. "I would like to see Compass first," she said, "and then I think we should have the conversation we should have had 2 years ago, and then we can discuss the ring." "That's fair," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I have been practicing fairness for some time now." He smiled. Not the almost smile she had seen at the October social years ago, the real one, full and unguarded, the smile he kept close to the center and did not let out easily. She had thought about that smile. She had remembered it more accurately than she'd expected. She smiled back. They went to the ranch on Saturday, as agreed. Eliza met them at the gate on Compass. The mare was a fine chestnut, well-built and attentive, and dismounted to embrace Lavinia with the specific enthusiasm of a girl who had been waiting 2 years for this particular Saturday. Lavinia held her and looked over her head at David, and something passed between them that was made of everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. Compass did, in fact, seem to recognize Lavinia. She came up to the fence and pushed her nose into Lavinia's palm with an attention that the horse generally reserved for Eliza and for the morning grain bucket. "I told you," Eliza said with satisfaction. "You told me," David confirmed. They spent the afternoon at the ranch. Lavinia and Eliza walked the orchard, which was dormant now but which Eliza described in detail which trees were best, which ones David had planted first, which one she had climbed and fallen from at age 7 and broken a finger on the way down. David followed at a slight distance, listening to the two of them, watching the ease between them, the way Eliza moved with full confidence in this woman's presence. He had not seen Eliza move with that confidence around an adult woman before. He had not, he realized, understood until this moment how much his daughter had been missing it. Not with pain, Eliza was not a miserable child, but with a certain constrained quality that she simply did not have right now, walking through the dead winter orchard with Lavinia Carter and talking about trees. After dinner, they sat in the front room, Eliza doing her arithmetic lesson at the table with her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration, and David and Lavinia sat by the fire and had the conversation. Not all of it, enough of it. He told her about Briggs's visit, what Briggs had said, how he had let it feed the doubt that was already living in him. She told him about Briggs's visit to the schoolhouse, the papers, the deliberate construction of a story designed to place mistrust exactly where it would do the most damage. They talked about it plainly and without dramatics, two people examining a shared history from enough distance to see it clearly. "The thing that I cannot entirely forgive myself for," David said, "is that I knew somewhere that it wasn't right. That I had enough information to push back on what he was telling me and I didn't because I was already afraid." "I knew too," Lavinia said. "The papers he showed me were convincing, but they weren't proof of what he claimed. I was a doctor's daughter. I knew the difference between a document and evidence. I just chose not to pursue it. Because you were afraid of what you might find. Because I was afraid of what I had already found," she said quietly. "Of what it meant, of wanting it too much." He looked at her across the firelight. Eliza was still at the table, very focused on her arithmetic, though she had in fact finished it 6 minutes ago, and was engaged in the careful pretense of continued concentration, a subterfuge that she felt was entirely justified given the circumstances. "I'm not afraid of that anymore," David said. "Neither am I," said Lavinia. The turquoise ring came out of his coat pocket 2 days later, on a Monday evening, when Eliza was in bed and they were sitting on the porch in the cold December air with a lamp lit on the table between them and the stars overhead, the same stars that Clara had named years ago. He had told Lavinia about that, the stars and their names, sitting here now rather than in a churchyard, and she had listened with her full attention and said that Clara had been right. It did look like two roads meeting, that cluster above the western ridge. He took the ring from his pocket and held it out to her. "I know we have more to talk about," he said. "I know you have a position in Fort Griffin and decisions to make. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I am asking if you will take this back as an indication that I am not in any doubt about what I want, and that I would like the chance to show you that properly." Lavinia looked at the ring. The small turquoise stone caught the lamplight. She had worn it for 3 months, 2 years ago, and she had sent it back because she thought he had decided they were finished, and she would not hold onto something a man had asked to have returned. He had not asked to have it returned. He had only offered her an exit. She had taken the exit because she had not understood that exits can sometimes be traps of a different kind, the trap of pride, the trap of protection. She picked up the ring and slid it onto her right hand. Not her left, that was a conversation still to have, but her right, where it had been before, where it had sat through 3 months of summer in 1880. "I'm staying in Broken Creek through January," she said. "My contract in Fort Griffin ends in December and I have not renewed it." He was very still. "You did not renew it." "I did not renew it," she confirmed. "I thought that whether or not things worked out between us, I had probably stayed in Fort Griffin long enough. There are other towns, there are other schools." She paused. "This town has a school, in fact. The school board has been looking for a permanent teacher for 6 months," he said, "since Miss Abrams left to get married in September." "I know," said Lavinia. "I wrote to Otis Fenn before I came. He was very enthusiastic." "You wrote to Otis Fenn." "I am a practical woman," she said. "I wanted to be certain there were options beyond the one I was hoping for." He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had written to the school board before she had written to him, who had secured her own foundation before laying her heart on the table, because she had learned the hard way what it cost to have only one option and have it fail. He found this extraordinarily moving. He found it deeply characteristic of everything he had known and remembered and missed about her. "Lavinia," he said. "Yes. Would you be willing to come to dinner here on Friday?" "I would." "And Saturday, would you be willing to ride out with me to see the East Section? I have some plans I'd like your opinion on." "I would," she said again. She was smiling. "And in January, when your stay here is settled and we've had time to David," she said, with a gentleness that was also definite. "Yes to all of them. Yes to whatever you are working your way toward. I came here because I wanted to come home. I am in no hurry to leave again." He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, with the same deliberateness she used in everything she did, the certainty of a man who has made up his mind and is done with ambivalence. Her fingers closed around his. Overhead, the stars that Clara had named were very bright in the winter sky. December became January with a sureness and rightness that neither David nor Lavinia had felt in a long time. She took the school board position. Otis Fenn had been genuinely enthusiastic. It turned out, less because he had known her before and more because her credentials had improved considerably in 2 years. And she moved her things from Fort Griffin in 3 trunks and the carpet bag, and took up residence in the small house beside the schoolhouse again, where the loose board in the doorframe that she had fixed herself in 1880 had been replaced at some point by a proper board, but the doorframe itself still had the mark where she had hammered it. She noticed the mark, and she ran her fingers over it on her first night back, standing in the empty house before her trunks were fully unpacked, and she felt something she could only describe as arriving. Not returning that implied the destination had stayed the same while she'd been away, but arriving, as though the place she had come back to was new in the same direction as what it had been, a destination that had grown in the same direction she had and was ready to receive her accordingly. Eliza came every day after school, ostensibly to help with various tasks, actually to be near Lavinia with the unguarded enjoyment of a girl who had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. They fell into a rhythm that felt natural and unforced, not a performance of what they were supposed to be to each other, but the genuine thing, built from afternoons of conversation and shared work, and the specific kind of loyalty that comes from being seen accurately by someone who had no obligation to see you at all. David came every few days, which was the realistic frequency given the ranch work, and sometimes Lavinia rode out to Clearwater on Saturdays, and the life they were building was visible in its outlines by February, even if it had not yet been named in all its particulars. He proposed on a Saturday in March 1883 in the orchard, which was beginning to show its first green of the season. He did not plan it for the orchard specifically. He had been carrying the question for 3 weeks, and the orchard is simply where they happened to be, walking after dinner on an evening that had turned soft and warm with the first real breath of spring, and the question came out because it was the right moment and he had learned, at considerable cost, the dangers of waiting for a more appropriate time. "Lavinia, I want to ask you to marry me." She stopped walking. She turned to face him. He was standing in the early spring evening between 2 trees, the western sky still faintly gold, and he was looking at her with the full directness that she had come to understand was his version of being fully open, this particular stillness, this absolute attention. Not because of the school or the house or Eliza, though all 3 are part of why it makes sense, but because I am a better man when you are in my life, and I was a less complete one when you weren't, and I have no interest in being incomplete if I have a choice. She crossed the space between them and she kissed him, and it was not the careful, tender first kiss of 2 years ago, but something with more conviction, more certainty, more of the truth of both of them in it, and when she pulled back she said, "Yes," with very little hesitation and no reservations whatsoever. "That's a very precise acceptance. I am a very precise woman." "I know," he said. "I have been grateful for it from the beginning." They were married in June of 1883 in the Broken Creek Church, on a morning when the Texas Panhandle was green from spring rains, and the light fell clean and bright across the churchyard, where 2 years ago David Dawson had stood with a cup of cider and almost smiled at a woman who had just arrived in his town. The circuit preacher officiated. The entire town attended, which in Broken Creek was not a figure of speech but a literal description, because in a town this small an event of this nature is a communal occasion whether anyone specifically invites you or not. Eliza stood beside her father, in a dress she had been consulted about at length and had chosen carefully, white with a blue ribbon sash, and she held Compass's halter rope, because someone needed to Lavinia had asked that Compass be brought to the churchyard, which was an unusual request that had been received by the town with the warm approval that unusual requests sometimes earn when they come from people who are liked. Lavinia wore blue, a shade that her green eyes made significant. She had her mother's pearl earrings and her hair was pinned, but already, as they stood together before the preacher, beginning to come loose in the June wind, which was so entirely characteristic that David noticed it and felt a warmth so large it was almost difficult to contain. They said the words. The preacher was brief and sincere. When David put the ring on her finger, not the turquoise which had been on her right hand all this time, but a new ring, gold with a small turquoise stone inset, which he had commissioned from a jeweler in Amarillo. The whole churchyard was very quiet, the particular quiet of people witnessing something that is true. Eliza, when asked later what she had thought about during the ceremony, said, "I was mostly thinking about whether Compass was going to try to eat the flowers on Mrs. Finn's hat again." She paused, "But also I was thinking that I'm glad I found the letter." "So am I," said David. "So am I," said Lavinia. The first year of the marriage was not without its adjustments, because two people who have lived independently through their adult years, and who are both considerably formed by the time they come together, will always have to negotiate the territory between their separate habits and shared life, and David Dawson and Lavinia Dawson were no exceptions. She had strong opinions about how the books in the front room should be organized, which were different from his opinions, and they arrived at a compromise that satisfied neither of them entirely and both of them adequately, which is the natural outcome of most such negotiations. He had a tendency to manage worries internally rather than speaking them, which she had identified in the courtship, and which did not disappear simply because they were married. And they worked out a system over the course of many evenings by the fire, where she asked, and he answered, and the asking was direct, and the answering was honest, and neither of them confounded the thing by turning it into something it was not. Eliza adapted to the change with a grace that her teachers, who were now her stepmother's colleagues, remarked on. She had not had a mother at an age when she could remember having one, and she did not approach Lavinia as a mother substitute, but as the specific person Lavinia was, which made the relationship workable from the beginning because it was built on accuracy. They were alike in some ways, the directness, the appetite for learning, and different in others. Eliza had her father's quiet and her mother Clara's gift for the imaginative, while Lavinia was precise where Eliza was expansive. These differences made them interesting to each other. In the spring of 1884, Lavinia told David she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, matter-of-factly, sitting across the table with her coffee, and his response was to put down his coffee cup very carefully and reach across the table and take her hand and not say anything for a moment, in the way that he met the most significant things with silence first, because the silence was honest. "You are not afraid?" she asked. "I am a little afraid," he said. "I would be a fool not to be, but mostly I am glad." "Good," she said. "So am I." In November of 1884, they had a son. They named him James, which was David's father's name, and he arrived with dark hair like his father and a loud and assertive opinion about the temperature of the room, which Lavinia said she respected because she liked people who knew what they wanted. He was a healthy baby and he grew into a healthy boy, And from very early on, Eliza took to the role of older sister with a combination of authority and affection that James both submitted to and resented in equal measure, which was probably the appropriate ratio. Harlan Briggs's position in the county deteriorated gradually over the following years, as the water rights disputes he had counted on winning through influence were contested with the patient precision that David Dawson brought to anything he set his mind to. Briggs sold his largest holding in 1886 and moved to San Antonio, where he was reported to have established a comfortable enough life in land speculation, which was the kind of enterprise where his particular talents were at least applied to people who had specifically chosen to deal with him. David extended his range on the east section and put in a proper irrigation channel from the creek, and by 1887 Clearwater Ranch was one of the more prosperous operations in the county, which brought its own complications but also its satisfactions. He was appointed to the County Water Board that year, which meant that some of the disputes that had been managed through brute wealth in Briggs's era were now managed through something more resembling fairness. And this was one of the things he and Lavinia talked about on the porch in the evenings, the slow and imperfect but genuine project of making the place function more honestly. They talked about a great many things on those evenings. That was one of the particular gifts of their marriage. David sometimes thought that they could talk, not constantly. He was still a man who valued silence, and she respected that. But when they talked, they were really talking, in the way that had been true from almost the beginning, from a churchyard in October 1880 when she had asked what he read and he had told her, and the conversation had opened something in both of them that 4 years of forced silence had only temporarily closed. Eliza left for the normal school in Huntsville in the fall of 1887 to train as a teacher, which was not a surprise to anyone who had watched her grow up. Before she left, David hugged her on the porch in the early morning while her trunk was loaded, and he said, "I am proud of you," which was not a statement he made easily or often, and which she received accordingly. She hugged him back, and then she said, "Papa, I am glad I found that letter." "You have said so before," he told her. "I am saying it again," she said, "because I want you to know that I meant it. It was not an accident that I was looking in that Bible. Mrs. Aldrich had told me there were pressed flowers in it, and I had been looking for weeks, and I knew where it was, and I kept not going to look because I did not want to find the flowers and finish the search because I liked having a reason to keep looking through the Bible, and I am not sure I was meant to find it on purpose, but I think it was the right time." David stared at his daughter, this 12-year-old girl who had become 17 and was going to go out into the world and do considerable things. "You knew about the flowers for weeks. Mrs. Aldrich mentioned them in August," Eliza said. "I found the letter in November." "Eliza." "I was being thorough," she said, with a serenity that was entirely her own. "It is important to be thorough." He shook his head. He was laughing, not able to stop it, the way he laughed when Lavinia said something precise and unexpected. "Go get your education," he said. "Come home at Christmas." "I will," she said. "Take care of Mama Lavinia. She was tired last week. I noticed." She climbed into the wagon. David watched the wagon move down the road toward Broken Creek, and he stood on the porch until it was out of sight, and then he went inside to where Lavinia was in the kitchen with James, who was 3 years old and deeply invested in the question of what exactly was in the biscuit tin, and he stood in the doorway watching his wife redirect his son from the biscuit tin with the patient precision she brought to everything. And the morning light came through the window and caught the gold ring with the turquoise inset. And he thought about a sealed envelope in the pages of Psalms, and a daughter's voice reading words across 4 years of silence, and a woman who had written that she was not asking him to come back, only asking him to know the truth, and how knowing the truth had been in the end sufficient. "Eliza noticed you were tired last week," he said. Lavinia looked up from the biscuit tin negotiation. "Eliza is remarkably observant. She takes after her teacher." Lavinia smiled at him across the kitchen, the specific smile that was her truest one, the one without any reservation in it. "I have been meaning to tell you something," she said. I was going to wait until this evening, but since we are discussing observations. He felt the quality of what she was about to say before she said it, in the way that people who have learned to read each other come to feel these things before the words arrive. James is going to have a sibling, she said. He crossed the kitchen. He took her face in both hands with the gentleness that was one of the things she had come to know was the center of him, the thing he had kept most carefully hidden until he had decided she was worth the risk of showing it, and he kissed her with the full intention of a man who does nothing by half measure. James, betrayed by the sudden parental distraction, helped himself to a biscuit. In April of 1888, they had a daughter. They named her Clara Rose Clara for the woman who had loved the stars, and Rose because Lavinia had always liked the name, and because the spring when she was born was a remarkable one, the best in years, with wildflowers on the eastern hillside that Eliza, home for the Easter visit, declared were the finest she had seen. 4 children between them in the end, Eliza, James, Clara, and a second boy they named Thomas, who arrived in 1891, and who had Lavinia's green eyes and the specific stubbornness of a child, who has inherited the best and most challenging qualities of both parents simultaneously. David said, standing in the room after Thomas arrived, healthy and opinionated and very loud about it, that he suspected Thomas had gotten a double share. "He is simply thorough," Lavinia said, which was her favorite word for the Dawson quality of absolute certainty about one's own position, a quality she had come to find more endearing than exasperating most days. "Like Eliza," David said. "Like you," Lavinia said. "I know where it comes from." He sat beside her on the edge of the bed where she was recovering, their newest son in her arms, the Texas evening settling outside the window of Clearwater Ranch, the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to turn gold in the early autumn light. He had been sitting in this room earlier in the year, as it happened, sitting in the bedroom during the long night and the hours of waiting, and the moment when everything was all right, and the feeling of enormous gratitude for ordinary, particular, irreplaceable things that arrives reliably in such moments and then gradually diffuses back into the daily texture of life, where it belongs. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask. Are you happy here?" She looked at him. The question landed in her with the weight of everything it contained, the ranch and the school and the children and the years, and the letter in the Bible and the sealed envelope and the turquoise ring and the moment in March 1883 in the orchard between 2 spring trees when he had said yes to all of them. The question was not anxious. It was not seeking reassurance. It was simply the question of a man who loves someone and wants to know the true answer. "I am," she said. "I have been from the moment I came back. I was happy before, too, in the first year here, before everything went wrong. But that happiness had a conditional quality to it. It was waiting to see if it was allowed to stay. And now it is unconditional," she said simply. "That is the difference." He put his arm around her carefully, mindful of Thomas, who had settled into the temporary peace of a child who has made his point thoroughly enough to be satisfied with the result. Outside, James could be heard in the yard below the window, engaged in some project involving a great deal of running. Inside, the ranch was quiet in the specific way it was quiet at the end of a day that had been full and right. "I think about that letter sometimes," David said. "So do I. I think about 4 years of it sitting in that Bible. I think about the fact that I wrote it knowing I might never get a reply," Lavinia said, "that I wrote it anyway. Why did you, knowing that?" She considered it genuinely, as she always considered questions that deserved real answers. "Because it was the truth, and I have always believed that the truth is worth saying even when you don't know if anyone will hear it, even when it might come back unopened." She paused. "Though I did not precisely count on it coming back opened by your daughter 12 years old, reading it aloud in the kitchen." "That was not in the plan," he agreed. "But the plan was not what brought you to me," she said. "It was Eliza. It was her finding what you had hidden and refusing to let it stay hidden. Your daughter whom you raised." She looked at him steadily. "That is not nothing, David." He thought about this. He thought about a small girl with dark eyes going hunting for pressed flowers in the pages of Psalms and finding instead a sealed envelope, and the courage, or the stubbornness, or both, to open it and read the words aloud in a quiet kitchen to a man who had almost let them go unread forever. "No," he said. "It is not nothing." The years moved forward with the comfortable, irreversible momentum of a life that has found its proper shape. Eliza finished her training and came back to Broken Creek to teach for 2 years before eventually moving to Abilene, where she married a steady and decent lawyer named William, and had 3 children of her own, and corresponded with Lavinia every month in long, precise letters that were remarkable for their observation of the world and their unguarded affection. James grew into his father's seriousness and his mother's curiosity, and at 17 declared his intention to study medicine. Lavinia's father's influence felt across the distance of a grandfather he had only met twice, but whose books filled the shelves of the Clearwater front room, and whose approach to things his mother had absorbed and passed on. Clara Rose grew up to be a person who named things. She named every animal on the ranch, and she gave names to the star patterns visible from the back porch. And when she was old enough to understand where the habit came from, she went to her father and asked to hear the names that Clara, her namesake, had given to the stars. And he told her, and she added them to her own naming system, and this made something in David very quiet and very full. Thomas was the wild one, which was approximately what everyone had predicted from the moment of his loud arrival, but his wildness was joyful rather than destructive. And by the time he was 15, he was the best horseman on the ranch and had already broken and trained 4 horses with a patience and sensitivity that nobody had expected from a boy of such enthusiasm and limited restraint in other contexts. Lavinia said it made perfect sense. She said some people who could not be still for anything else could be perfectly still for the thing they loved most. Clearwater Ranch continued to grow and to thrive, and the community of Broken Creek grew around it. A second store, a newspaper in 1886, a proper bank in 1889, a doctor's office in 1892, and Lavinia continued to teach in the schoolhouse beside which she had first lived in 1880, with the repaired doorframe and the mark of her own hammer still visible if you looked at the right angle in the right light. She was known for her students long before they left her classroom, and known for them for years after, and the particular thing that her students said about her, not always in these words but in this meaning, was that she had seen them before they had seen themselves. She was 53 years old when she retired from teaching, and the school board gave her a dinner that the whole town attended, and Otis Fenn's daughter, who was one of her former students and was now on the school board herself, made a speech. Eliza came back for it with William and the 3 grandchildren. James came from Abilene, where he had a small medical practice. Clara and Thomas were already home. David sat beside her at the dinner table and held her hand, and she let him, which was not something she did in public generally, her instinct for professional self-containment having not entirely dissolved even after 30 years. But tonight she let him, because it seemed to be called for, because the room was full of the evidence of a life that had been worth building, and because the man beside her had been the decision that made the rest possible. After the dinner, after the speeches and the gifts and the warm, chaotic reunion of a large family and most of a town, they walked home to the ranch in the cool night air, the 2 of them, while the children and grandchildren came behind at a distance that was respectful and slightly calculated. "Well," Lavinia said. "Well," David said. They walked in the comfortable silence that is available only to people who have spent enough years together to have fully mapped each other, who know the weight of the silence and what it contains and are at ease with both. "Are you sorry to leave it?" he asked. "The school?" She thought about it. "No, it was the right time. I knew when I gave it up." She looked up at the stars. "I am sorry to leave the children, the students, but Eliza's daughter is going to be magnificent, and she will have better teachers than I was." "She will not." "She will," Lavinia said, with the precision of a woman who remains objective about herself. I was a very good teacher in 1880. Teachers get better every 10 years if they're paying attention. She will be better. Eliza's daughter has your books, he said. Half of what she knows she learned from your shelves. The other half she learned from Eliza, who learned it from you. He put his arm around her as they walked, the stars overhead, the ranch ahead, the children behind. He thought about the turquoise ring, which she still wore, and which had been added to years ago by a wedding band that she wore beside it, the two rings sitting together on her left hand, as though they had always been meant to occupy the same space. He thought about a sealed envelope in the pages of Psalms. He thought about the 4 years it had taken him to open it, or rather the 4 years he had refused to open it, and the 12-year-old girl who had finally done what he had been too afraid to do, and had changed everything by reading 7 sentences aloud in a quiet kitchen. He thought about what Lavinia had said, that she had written the letter knowing she might never get a reply, that the truth was worth saying even when you could not know if it would be heard. He had thought about that observation many times over 30 years, and it had never stopped being true, and it had never stopped being one of the particular gifts she had given him, the insistence on honesty as its own sufficient justification, not contingent on outcome. Lavinia, yes, I want to tell you something. Then tell me. The day Eliza found the letter, he said, and read it aloud. The worst moment in my life up to that point was believing your letter was a final rejection and hiding it because I could not read those words. And that same morning, hearing those words, which were not a rejection at all but the opposite, was the best moment I had had in 4 years. I know, she said quietly. I think Eliza knew it too in her way. I think she might have, he said, though she claims she was merely being thorough. Lavinia laughed. Her laugh had not changed in 30 years. It came from the same place, genuine, unguarded, the specific sound of a woman who found the world more amusing and more wonderful than painful, which was not naivety but a deliberate practice, a discipline she had maintained through hard years and good ones with the same steady commitment she brought to everything worth having. She was thorough, Lavinia said. She found exactly what needed to be found. They reached the gate of Clearwater Ranch, and he opened it for her, and she went through, and they stood for a moment in the yard with the ranch house ahead of them, the lights of it warm in the night, the sound of the creek audible just past the cottonwoods, the stars overhead in all their Texas abundance, the same stars that Clara had named, the same stars that Lavinia had looked at in a churchyard on a winter night in 1880 and thought about a man who was careful with his warmth. The same stars that Clara Rose now added her own names to, building on an inheritance of observation and love that moved forward through people the way the most important things always do. David Dawson took his wife's hand and they walked together toward their home, toward the warm light and the children and the life that had been built from honesty and stubbornness, and a letter that had been hidden too long and finally heard. The creek ran clear in the dark beside the cottonwoods, and the stars burned white and steady in the winter sky, and everything was exactly as it should be.